30 years ago, the British government was the biggest landlord in Europe. Today, it houses relatively few of us, and that's because of what happened right here.
You almost certainly won't recognise this street, but here in Essex, about 30 years ago, a revolution happened. It was actually the biggest privatisation in British history, and I'm not talking about electricity or gas, but the sale of British council houses. And actually the first one was just here, at the end of this street, sold for £8,000 all the way back in 1980. And it's just, as luck would have it, been sold again for £260,000. Somewhere along the line, a lot of people have made a lot of money from something that used to belong to all of us. And now the latest chapter in this right to buy story is about to start all over again, probably in a street near you.
I've looked at other councils in the UK. I mean, I've looked down in Essex, I've looked at Essex Council, I've looked at Waltham Forest, which is where I used to live, and the same thing again, 25, 30-year waiting lists.
Well, the government talks about a one-to-one replacement, but currently there's only a 1 in 8 replacement, so the government would need to drastically change its approach.
Channeling his inner Margaret Thatcher, David Cameron announced last year the government was going to extend Right to Buy to housing association tenants. Remember, Right to Buy is a scheme where the government offers big discounts to council tenants to buy their homes. Now housing association tenants will enjoy the same opportunity. The first sales are expected imminently. The problem is, unlike council houses, the government doesn't own these homes, so has to compensate the housing associations accordingly. That could cost billions of pounds. So how does the government suggest we pay for them?
That's why Conservatives have committed to building a property-owning democracy for generations. And today I can tell you what this generation of Conservatives is going to do about it. As the most expensive council properties fall vacant, we're going to require councils to sell them off. And we'll replace them with new affordable housing in the same area.
However, now we know how the legislation is going to work in detail, and there may be two important snags, starting with those so-called expensive council house sell-offs.
Now you might imagine that when the government says they're going to force councils to sell off their most expensive properties, then they might look something a little bit like this one. Whereas in fact, it also means selling houses like this. This is in Southwark in South London. This is in Nuneaton. This is a £3 million townhouse. But this is a 2-bed bungalow. And this would have to be sold as soon as it became vacant by the council to fund the sale of housing association properties. And that's because the law says that every council up and down the country has to sell off their more expensive homes. That money is then divvied up, put into a pot and given to the housing associations to compensate them. The problem is if you don't have houses like this, many councils will have to sell houses a bit like that one over there.
The original intention was that some expensive council houses in London would be sold off and this would make the difference. That's just not the case. During the passage of this Act, government changed the definition to call it higher value properties. Now we've estimated that's £26 million worth of homes per council across the country, and that we've done some research. That's 2-bedroom properties in West Midlands, in Dudley. It's not big fancy homes in London, it's homes all across the country.
This city is undergoing a construction boom, and you can see it on the skyline behind me. Development of every shape and size, commercial, business, residential. The one type of development you're unlikely to see is new council housing, and that's a big problem because the government said that every home lost under this new scheme would be replaced by a new council house. Unfortunately, on the basis of their current record, that seems quite unlikely.
This estate was recently built by Haringey Council and a housing association in North London as a mixture of social rent and shared ownership. The council there fears this new legislation means it may have to be sold off and that it wouldn't be replaced.
As the funding system works, it's simply impossible for us to replace them to that extent. Nationally, only 1 in 8 council homes are rebuilt, and we think that the government should cut the red tape and let councils build. It's hard to replace right to buy properties because of government rules, which means that councils have to put up most of the money. You can't use right to buy money with any other grant, which is commonly used, and that really restricts the number of homes that you can build.
And this is a problem, because if we assume that we need to sell around 113,000 council houses to compensate housing associations, and only 1 in 8 are replaced, then we'll lose around 100,000 social homes permanently. And when you consider we have nearly 2 million people on the council house waiting list, those are houses we can ill afford to lose. People like Lorna need them. She lost her job, the home she owned, and now faces eviction from her private tenancy.
For over 30 years, I was in full-time employment, and now this has happened. So having to sell the house was the worst thing that could happen to me. I had my car repossessed. It was just a horrible time. And now, at a time when I really need help, I didn't even approach the council back then. I just went for the private let. But now, I really do need the help, and it's just not there.
She's been told by her local authority she'll have a 25-year wait for a council home.
I did think that, given my situation and the fact that I do have a disability, it would have been taken into consideration. But, basically, the lady I spoke to was called a housing options officer. There wasn't any option she could actually offer.
You must have been quite scared during this whole experience, the thought of potentially being homeless, I suppose.
When I knew I was going to lose a house, I went into a terrible depression, and I just couldn't pull myself up out of it. And at one point, I actually come close to suicide. I genuinely did. There's going to be people like me in a situation where you've lost your home for whatever reason, you're on a low income, you need somewhere to live. So there needs to be something in place to help anybody that needs help. They're not dealing with it from the bottom up.
This brings us to the second apparent snag. Even if we assume the government can replace those council houses, where will they be built? And will they even be council homes at all?
I'll never be able to afford to go back there again.
There is no guarantee that these will be replaced like for like. What's most likely to happen is they'll be replaced by the government's starter homes. And these are homes to buy. The minimum value probably in most places between 250,000 outside London and 450,000 in London. So this is a sell-off of reasonable, good, affordable homes to pay for homes to buy, which most people can't afford.
In the 1980s, Right to Buy transformed the lives of millions of people who would never have had the chance to own their own homes. In its newest guise, hundreds of thousands of housing association tenants will do the same. But now we know the nuts and bolts of Right to Buy Mark II, questions are being asked as to whether this new policy will make the biggest social housing crisis in 70 years worse still.
Well, we asked the government to talk to us about the issue this morning, but they declined. In a statement, the Housing Minister, Brandon Lewis, told us this government makes no apology for helping people into home ownership. The truth is there are billions of pounds locked up in local authority housing assets. So it's only right that when higher value homes become vacant, they are sold to support home ownership through Right to Buy and reinvested in building new homes that better meet local needs.